Just as the race was about to begin, a warhorse suddenly broke through the fence, charging wildly after an unfamiliar young girl. When the police finally saw the horse, everyone was left stunned. The buzz at the racetrack was almost electric. It was the day of the big race, and Lennox moved through the stables with a tense expression, adjusting his worn baseball cap as he walked. "Solara's ready, right?" he asked one of the stable hands while carefully inspecting the horse's legs. The stallion, a creature with a sleek coat and calm, steady eyes, was known for his composure, even in the most chaotic moments. Yet, Lennox couldn't shake the knot in his stomach. Today was too important. The track was surrounded by a sea of spectators, from families with young kids clutching cotton candy to sharp-suited men placing extravagant bets. Everyone seemed to share in the excitement that vibrated through the air. Voices swirled together with the metallic clang of bells and the steady rhythm of hooves pounding against compacted dirt. The smells of hay and leather were unmistakable, familiar, even comforting. Solara, unbothered by the noise and the crowd, seemed at ease, his breathing even as Lennox gave him one last reassuring pat on the neck. But everything shifted the moment she appeared. She was young and out of place amidst the polished crowd. Dressed in simple, worn clothes, she moved with a quiet confidence that seemed to defy the curious glances thrown her way. Her dark hair fell in wild, loose waves around her shoulders, and her eyes, unusually bright, absorbed every detail like they were searching for something. She stopped near Solara's stable, resting a hand on the wooden post. The horse, calm and still up until that point, suddenly raised his head. His ears pricked forward, and a sharp snort escaped his nostrils. Lennox, too busy arguing with the jockey about race strategy, didn't notice the shift right away. "What the hell?" muttered one of the grooms, stepping back warily. Solara began to fidget, pawing at the ground with his hooves, as if disturbed by something unseen. The girl didn't flinch. Her eyes locked with Solara's, and for a fleeting moment, something intangible seemed to pass between them, like an unspoken secret that only they could understand. The tension snapped when Solara let out a loud, piercing whinny that brought several heads around. Suddenly, the stallion reared up on his hind legs with a force so powerful it seemed barely contained. Shouts erupted from the people nearby. "Solara, easy!" Lennox yelled, lunging toward the corral. But before he could reach him, Solara slammed into the wooden gate, splintering it with one violent thrust. Chaos unfolded. The crowd scattered, forming a wide, frantic circle around the scene as the horse charged forward, his gaze locked on the girl. "Watch out!" someone screamed. But the young woman didn't move. Instead, she took a step forward, her hand rising calmly as if to halt him. Solara skidded to a stop just inches from her. His heavy breaths puffed into small clouds in the cool air, the energy around them palpable. For a moment, everything fell still. It was as though time itself had paused to witness what was happening. Lennox, breathless and wide-eyed, watched the scene unfold, unable to comprehend it. Who was this girl? And why was his horse, normally so composed, acting like he was possessed? Then, the impossible happened. The girl placed her hand gently against Solara's muzzle. "Easy," she whispered, her voice soft but steady, barely audible over the fading noise of the crowd. Against all reason, the horse listened. The tension in his powerful muscles began to ebb, his movements slowing as he relaxed beneath her touch. Before Lennox could react, the girl, with the kind of grace that spoke of long experience, swung herself onto Solara's back. It was effortless, so natural that it was clear riding was second nature to her. There was no saddle, no reins, yet somehow they didn't seem necessary. "Hey, stop!" Lennox shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of the crowd. The young woman turned her head slightly, her eyes glinting with a strange mix of defiance and resolve. Without a word, she applied a subtle pressure with her legs. Solara bolted into a gallop, her powerful hooves kicking up a cloud of dust as they sped away. Within seconds, both horse and rider vanished through the exit of the racetrack, a fleeting shadow dissolving into the horizon. Lennox stood frozen, the rising panic tightening in his chest. "What the hell just happened?" he muttered, his mind scrambling to make sense of the chaos. Around him, the crowd's attention had shifted. The excited hum of spectators gave way to hushed murmurs and curious glances. Small clusters formed as people whispered theories and pointed fingers. Some watched Lennox with suspicion, others with blatant disapproval, as though the entire ordeal was somehow his fault. Dust hung in the air, lingering evidence of Solara's departure, and of the enigmatic young woman who'd ridden off as if the two were made of the same spirit. The low, incessant murmurs grated on Lennox's nerves, but he forced himself to focus. He didn't need their judgment. He needed action. Pulling in a deep breath, Lennox fumbled for his phone, his hands trembling as he dialed. 911? I need to report something. It's complicated. My horse, Solara. She was taken. No, not stolen exactly. It's not that simple. His voice wavered as he swallowed hard, forcing himself to continue. A young woman. She just got on and rode off. It happened minutes ago, at the racetrack. The dispatcher's sharp, methodical questions only added to his disorientation. He closed his eyes and tried to describe the woman. Dark hair, long, maybe in her early 20s, or younger. She wore plain clothes, nothing that stood out. I don't know anything else, but... Lennox hesitated, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. There was something about the way she did it, like she knew what she was doing. The dispatcher promised to send a patrol and instructed him to stay put. But standing still wasn't an option. Ignoring the questioning eyes and muttered accusations of those around him, some of whom speculated it had all been some trick to keep Solara from racing, Lennox moved. His boots crunched against the gravel as he headed toward the racetrack's exit. By the time the police cruiser rolled in, Lennox had replayed the events over and over in his mind, searching for something he might have missed. 3 officers stepped out, led by a middle-aged man with a thick mustache and the kind of weary gaze that said he'd seen it all. You the owner of the horse? Yes, sir, Lennox replied, forcing himself to keep his voice steady. Her name is Solara. She's special. You have to find her. The officer flipped open a notepad and began jotting down Lennox's statement as he recounted, word for word, what he'd already told the dispatcher. The other officers spread out, scanning the grounds, questioning bystanders who were more concerned about lost bets than the bizarre disappearance. One of them spoke up. Some folks say the horse was headed toward town. That true? Lennox nodded. Yes. That's the last I saw of them. The officer with the mustache regarded Lennox skeptically, his expression somewhere between patience and doubt. Horses don't usually run off like that, especially with strangers. You sure there wasn't something more? A reason the animal would follow her? Lennox hesitated. He couldn't explain it. The brief, undeniable moment when Solara had locked eyes with the young woman. It was as though the two shared some silent understanding, an unspoken bond he couldn't hope to articulate. I don't know, he admitted finally, but I saw something. Something happened between them. The search began almost immediately. Officers scattered, interviewing witnesses, though few had anything useful to share. Most people had barely glanced at the incident, too preoccupied with the race or their failed bets to care. Others repeated what Lennox already knew. The woman had appeared out of nowhere, mounted Solara effortlessly, and vanished as quickly as she'd come. Still, Lennox couldn't stand idly by. Every nerve in his body buzzed with the need to act, to do something. He had to find Solara. He insisted on accompanying the patrol as they searched for any possible leads. They drove slowly toward the town center, eyes scanning for signs of Solara or the young woman. The mustached officer kept the radio buzzing, sporadically receiving reports from other officers in the area. An old man standing at a street corner was the first to offer anything of use. "Yeah, I saw them go by," he said, gesturing toward a narrow street. The horse was fast, moving like it knew exactly what it was doing. They went that way. The patrol followed the lead, but when they reached the end of the street, there was no trace of them. "It's like they vanished," murmured one of the officers. Those words clung to Lennox's mind as the patrol car's engine growled into the quiet of the night. This is strange. The phrase carried an unsettling weight, as if the old man knew more than he was letting on. The search along the suggested path turned up nothing, and the officers decided to head back to the racetrack to regroup. But Lennox, trapped in a mix of frustration and restless anxiety, stayed behind. When the last patrol car disappeared into the shadows of the road, Lennox walked slowly toward the stables. The quiet there felt almost tangible after the day's chaos. The familiar smells of hay and damp wood, soaked from the night's dew, brought him a fleeting calm, but his mind wouldn't stop spinning. And then he saw it, a small slip of paper neatly folded and placed carefully on the wooden door of the stall where Solara had been. Lennox frowned, his fingers trembling as he took the note. The words scrawled across the paper were short but clear. "Go to the back stable. Come alone. Don't call the cops." His heart thundered as he headed toward the back stable. It was smaller, less used, and cloaked in heavy shadows, barely touched by the silver gleam of moonlight. The silence there was absolute, broken only by the crunch of gravel under his boots. When he arrived, he saw a figure leaning against the wooden wall. It was a thin man, scruffy-looking, wearing an old jacket and a hat that partially obscured his face. A cigarette hung lazily from his lips, its smoke curling slowly into the night air. "Lennox, right?" the man said, his voice low and rough. "Who are you, and what do you know about my horse?" Lennox's voice was tight, the tension unmistakable. The man took one final drag of the cigarette before flicking it to the ground and crushing it beneath his boot. "Let's just say I'm someone who watches. And tonight, I saw something you might want to hear." The story that followed came in slow, deliberate pauses, as though the man was carefully choosing each word. He claimed he'd been at the racetrack that afternoon, not to bet, but out of curiosity. That's when he first noticed the young woman. "She showed up early, before the noise and chaos," he explained, his sharp eyes calculating as they met Lennox's. "I picked her up on the highway, just outside town." "Why'd you bring her here? Didn't that seem suspicious?" Lennox snapped, his arms crossing impatiently. "She was just a girl, didn't look dangerous. Quiet, mostly. But..." The man hesitated. Something was off about her. She asked a lot of questions about the horses, about their names. When I mentioned Solara, though, she went silent. Didn't say a word, but something changed in her face, like she'd found exactly what she was looking for. A chill ran down Lennox's spine. "And you didn't think that was strange?" The man shrugged. "Like I said, she didn't seem dangerous. Now, well, things aren't always what they seem, are they?" The conversation reached its turning point when the man dug into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. "This is what you're after," he said, holding it out toward Lennox. "It's a place, a ranch just outside of town. I heard her mention it when she thought I wasn't paying attention." Lennox snatched the paper and unfolded it, his eyes narrowing as he read the hastily written address. He didn't recognize the location, but something about the man's tone told him it wasn't a lie. Still, doubt gnawed at him. "Why are you helping me?" he finally asked, fixing the man with a hard, skeptical look. The man let out a dry, humorless laugh, a sound as sharp as brittle wood snapping. "Let's just say I don't like people playing with things that don't belong to them. That girl," the man continued, "there's something strange about her. If you want to know more, you'll have to figure it out yourself." Lennox pressed his lips together, slipping the folded paper into his pocket. The man didn't give him time for more questions. With a small nod of his head, he stepped away into the darkness, fading into the shadows as though he had never been there. Left alone, Lennox felt the calm of the place twist into something heavy, suffocating. He looked down at the paper in his hand. The address scribbled on it seemed like a riddle begging to be solved. For a brief moment, he thought about calling the police, but something stopped him. The way the man spoke about the girl, the unspoken connection between her and Solara, it all felt deeper, more personal. If he brought the authorities into this, he feared things would spiral even further out of control. Taking a deep breath, Lennox made up his mind. He'd go to the ranch alone. He didn't know what he would find, but something in his gut told him this was the next step he needed to take. By dawn, Lennox was driving along a dirt road, the truck rattling over uneven terrain. The fields on either side were bathed in the soft light of sunrise, golden and quiet. The paper, now crumpled from being checked so many times, rested on the passenger seat. Every mile he drove pulled him further from the noise of the racetrack, from the crowds, from everything familiar. It was as if he were leaving his world behind. Eventually, the ranch came into view on the horizon. At first glance, it was peaceful. A modest wooden house surrounded by stables, sprawling land, and horses grazing lazily in the open fields. The air was filled with the sounds of morning, birdsong, the faint creak of branches in the breeze, the distant whinny of a horse. But beneath the beauty of it all, Lennox couldn't shake the knot in his stomach. Something about this tranquility didn't sit right. He parked the truck near a weathered wooden fence and climbed out, his steps cautious. Just as he crossed the main gate, a woman's voice called out from the stables, "Took you long enough to find me?" Lennox spun toward the sound. There she was, the girl who had taken Solara, Elara. She leaned casually against the stable door, arms crossed, a calm but challenging look on her face. "Where's my horse?" Lennox demanded, trying to keep his voice steady, though it came out sharper than he'd intended. Elara studied him for a moment before tilting her head toward the inside of the stable. "She's here," she said simply, "better than she's been in years." Lennox didn't wait for an invitation. His boots hit the ground hard as he strode toward the entrance. Inside, in a spacious corral, stood Solara. The horse he'd known so well, the one he'd seen nervous and restless at the track, looked different. Her body was relaxed, her stance calm as she contentedly chewed on a mouthful of hay. For a moment, Lennox couldn't believe what he was seeing. "What did you do to her?" he asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and the faintest trace of anger. "Nothing she didn't want," Elara replied, taking a step toward him. "I just brought her back to where she belongs." The statement threw Lennox off. "What's that supposed to mean?" "That horse is mine," he said firmly. "I've cared for her, trained her. Sure, I've put her in races, but I've never harmed her." Ilara let out a slow breath, as though preparing herself for a truth she'd been waiting to share. The defiance in her posture eased, replaced by something softer, almost sorrowful. "Maybe you don't understand yet," she said, her voice low but steady. "But there are things you don't know about Solara, about where she comes from." Lennox folded his arms, impatient, but he didn't interrupt. "She was born here," Ilara explained, turning her gaze to where Solara stood peacefully in the stable, oblivious to the tension in the air. "Her mother was one of the mares we rescued years ago. She came to us in terrible shape, malnourished, scared and pregnant. My parents saved her life before she could be put down." Lennox blinked, processing what she was saying. He'd always believed Solara came from a flawless bloodline, as the papers had suggested. But now, that certainty cracked like thin ice beneath him. Now, that image was beginning to crumble. "He was just a small, fragile colt at first," Ilara began, a faint, melancholic smile curving her lips. "But he had a spirit no one could ignore. Even as a baby, you could see that fire, that energy, the same kind you've probably seen on the tracks." "And where do you fit into all of this?" Lennox asked, his voice carefully neutral, though a part of him already knew the answer. Ilara stepped closer to the paddock, her hand resting on the weather-worn wooden fence. "We grew up together. I was just a little girl and he was my best friend. We spent hours out here, running through the fields, playing together. He trusted me the same way I trusted him." She turned to Lennox, her eyes clouded with a mix of nostalgia and sadness. "But keeping a place like this isn't easy. Rescues cost money, and sometimes my parents had to make tough decisions. When someone came along offering a good price for a young, promising colt, they didn't have much choice but to sell him." A pang of remorse stirred in Lennox's chest. He could picture that little girl watching helplessly as her best friend was taken away, unable to do anything to stop it. But still, something didn't quite add up. "And what happened after that?" he asked softly, his tone gentler now. Ilara pulled away from the paddock, her steps slow as she moved toward the shadow of a nearby tree. "He changed hands a few times," she said, the words heavy as if each one hurt to say. "At first, a man bought him for show competitions, but when he saw the colt's potential for something bigger, he sold him again, to someone in the racing world." She paused, and Lennox saw her fists clench tightly at her sides. "Those men don't see horses. They see machines, investments. They don't care if they're scared or tired. All they want are results." Lennox looked away, uneasy. He knew she wasn't wrong. Even though he'd tried to care for Solara the best he could, the racing world was not a kind place. "Then, when I saw him at the racetrack," Ilara stopped, her voice catching as though reliving the moment. "I couldn't believe it. It had been years. But he still recognized me. I saw it in his eyes. And when he did, I knew I couldn't leave him there." Lennox fell silent for a long moment. There was something deeply human in what she was saying, something that struck a part of him he'd ignored for far too long. "What you did was reckless," he said finally, breaking the silence. "You could have gotten yourself into serious trouble. You could have gotten both of us hurt." "I know," Ilara replied, holding his gaze steadily. "But I also knew I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. Not after everything he meant to me. If you were in my shoes, Lennox, I think you would have done the same thing." Lennox didn't respond right away. He knew she was right. There was something undeniable in the connection between Ilara and Solara, a bond he couldn't ignore. But that didn't change the reality of the situation they now found themselves in. The next morning arrived heavy with tension. The air around the ranch was cold and damp, but inside the small sitting room where Lennox, Ilara, and her parents had gathered, the atmosphere was suffocating. The police had come back early, determined to settle a conflict that now felt more emotional than legal. The mustached officer, professional but visibly weary, was the first to speak. "Miss Ilara, as we've explained, this horse legally belongs to Mr. Lennox. While I understand your reasons, the law is clear. If you don't return the animal," he continued, "this situation could escalate." Ilara sat upright, her back straight, eyes locked on the officer. Her voice was calm, but unyielding. "I didn't steal him. Solara recognized me and followed me. I just brought him to where he wanted to be." "That doesn't matter," the officer snapped, his voice beginning to fray with impatience. "A horse can't choose who its owner is. You took it without permission, and there are consequences for that." Lennox, who had remained quiet until now, raised a hand in an attempt to defuse the situation. "Wait!" His voice was calmer than he felt. "Before we make any hasty decisions, I want to understand something." He turned toward Ilara, his gaze searching her for answers. "Why wait until now? If you knew what Solara meant to you, why didn't you come to me sooner? Why didn't you talk to me?" Ilara dropped her gaze for a moment, her resolve wavering. Finally, with a heavy sigh, she spoke. "It wasn't easy. When I found out he was racing, I thought, maybe it was okay. Maybe they were taking better care of him than I ever could. But when I saw him that day, when I saw how he reacted to me, I knew it wasn't right. I knew he wasn't happy." "And you thought stealing him was the solution?" Lennox's tone hovered between frustration and disbelief. "It wasn't theft," Ilara insisted. "It was a rescue." Before Lennox could respond, a deeper voice cut through the tension. Ilara's father, a sturdy man with hands worn from years of hard work in the fields, rose from his chair. "All of this started because of choices we made," he said, looking first at Ilara, then at Lennox. "When we sold Solara, we didn't think about what would come next. We only saw a way to keep this place going. But if we'd known where he'd end up, if we'd known what he would mean to Ilara." Ilara's mother, petite but carrying a presence just as strong, spoke next, her voice thick with emotion. "We regret it every day. Maybe that doesn't change anything, but it's the truth." Lennox felt a twinge of empathy at their words. He understood what it meant to make difficult choices out of necessity, but he also knew that no amount of regret could undo the past. "I understand why you did it," he said at last, breaking the silence. "But Solara, he's part of my life now. He's not just a horse to me. He's so much more." The tension in the room seemed to shift, becoming something heavier, more sorrowful. The officer, his mustache twitching, gave Lennox a pointed look as though silently urging him to resolve the matter before he had to step in. "So, what do you want to do, Lennox?" Ilara's voice was soft, barely a whisper. "Are you going to take him? Because if you are, I won't fight you anymore. I won't put my parents or this ranch in jeopardy because of me." Ilara's words struck Lennox hard. He knew he had every right to claim Solara, but he also understood now that the horse wasn't just his. Solara had a history, a story that seemed far more entwined with Ilara and this ranch than he had realized. He crossed his arms, his eyes drifting to the window. Outside he could see the stables, where Solara's silhouette stood bathed in the soft afternoon light. The horse looked calm, at peace. It was a kind of tranquility Lennox couldn't ignore. He spent the rest of the afternoon wandering the ranch, his boots crunching softly against the dirt with every step. Each moment brought him closer to the stables, where Solara rested, and with each passing minute, Lennox's certainty unraveled further. His mind was a whirlwind of memories. The early days training Solara, the pride he'd felt watching him win his first race, the long hours spent simply observing him, admiring his strength and elegance. But now those moments were clouded by the image of Ilara. Her quiet conviction, her honesty, and the undeniable peace he'd seen in Solara since they'd arrived here. It was a peace Lennox couldn't recall ever seeing before. Finally, Lennox found himself at the stables. The sun was beginning its slow descent, draping the ranch in warm, golden hues. Solara stood quietly in the paddock, head lowered as she lazily nibbled at a clump of hay. Lennox approached slowly, as though afraid to disturb something sacred. "Hey there, girl," he murmured softly, almost a whisper. Solara lifted her head, her dark, deep eyes locking onto him. There was a calmness in them that Lennox didn't quite remember, a quiet wisdom that made him feel as though she understood far more than he did. He reached out and ran a hand along her neck, feeling the softness of her coat beneath his fingertips. "What am I going to do with you, huh?" he asked, though he wasn't really looking for an answer. For a while, Lennox just stood there, his hand moving gently across Solara's neck, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing. Slowly, something began to stir within him, an understanding, faint at first, but growing stronger with each moment. It was like the gradual light of dawn after the darkest part of the night. Back at the house, Ilara sat alone on the front porch, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon. Inside, her parents gave her the space she seemed to need, leaving her to wrestle with her thoughts. When she saw Lennox walking up from the paddock, she straightened slightly, bracing herself for the answer she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. "Have you decided?" Ilara asked, her voice steady but layered with emotions she was trying to keep in check. Lennox stopped a few steps away, his gaze shifting briefly toward the barn before settling on her. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice low but certain. "I think I know what she needs." Ilara held his gaze, not saying a word, waiting for him to continue. "It wasn't easy," Lennox admitted, his voice softening as he went on. "But standing there, seeing her so calm, so at peace, it made me realize something. Maybe I've been thinking more about what I want than what she needs." For a long moment, silence fell between them, broken only by the distant crow of a rooster and the quiet rustling of leaves in the breeze. "She stays," Lennox said at last, each word carrying a weight that seemed to lift as he spoke them. "Solara stays here. With you." Ilara blinked, as though she couldn't quite believe what she'd just heard. "Really?" she asked, her voice unsteady with emotion. Lennox nodded, a small but sure motion. "Yeah, I think this is her place. It always was. Just promise me you'll take care of her. Give her what she needs to be happy." Ilara stood up then, her eyes bright as she stepped closer to him. "I promise," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "You won't regret this, Lennox. I swear." That night, Lennox sat down to dinner with Ilara and her family. The conversation was easy and warm, filled with shared memories and talk of Solara's future on the ranch. Ilara's parents thanked him repeatedly for his decision, their gratitude palpable. Though Lennox didn't say it out loud, he felt a small measure of peace beginning to settle within him, like the first breath of cool air after a long, scorching day. Before heading to bed, Lennox made his way back to the barn one last time. Solara lay resting, her body relaxed under the faint glow of the moonlight that streamed through the rafters. Lennox crouched beside her, running a hand gently along her side. "I'm gonna miss you, girl," he whispered, his voice catching slightly. "But I know you'll be okay here. This is where you belong." The next morning, Lennox prepared to leave the ranch. Ilara walked him to his truck, her hands clasped tightly to her chest, as though she were holding something fragile and precious. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with both gratitude and respect as she looked up at him. Lennox gave her a small, final smile, nodding before climbing into the truck. As he pulled away down the gravel road, he felt a strange mix of sadness and relief, a bittersweet ache that somehow felt right. He had left Solara behind, but in doing so, he had gained something far more profound, a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to care for and love someone, even if that meant letting them go. The landscape drifted by as he drove, but his mind remained back at the ranch, with Solara and the young woman who had fought so hard to restore the horse's freedom. For the first time in a long while, Lennox allowed himself to imagine a different future, one where perhaps there was something more beyond the races and the bets. The weeks that followed were quiet, but not without meaning. For Solara, the transition seemed so natural, it was as if she had returned to a state of grace Lennox could barely remember. On the ranch, the horse wandered freely across the vast pastures with a light, carefree energy that stood in stark contrast to the tense, coiled power she'd shown during competition. In the mornings, Ilara watched from the porch, a warm cup of coffee in her hands, as Solara galloped across the rolling hills. Her mane streamed behind her like a banner of the freedom she had finally reclaimed. Sometimes, Ilara would approach with a handful of hay, or simply stroke the horse's neck, whispering softly as though they shared some quiet, sacred secret. One day, Lennox returned to the ranch, not to reclaim what had been his, but to learn. He had been turning over everything Ilara had said and everything Solara had shown him through her newfound freedom. When he arrived, Ilara greeted him with an open, genuine smile, free of the tension that had marked their earlier meetings. "How's everything going?" Lennox asked as he stepped down from his truck. "It's going great," Ilara said, gesturing toward the fields. "Look at her. I don't think I've ever seen her this happy." Lennox followed her gaze. Solara was trotting near a grove of oak trees, her movements relaxed, almost playful. A small, wistful smile tugged at the corners of Lennox's mouth. "Maybe you were right, all along," he admitted softly, turning to Ilara. "This is where she belongs." Ilara looked at him with gratitude, though there was something deeper in her expression, a recognition of the courage it took for Lennox to let Solara go. It was the kind of selfless act that few would ever have the strength to make. They spent the afternoon walking through the ranch. Ilara showed him the work they did rehabilitating rescued horses, explaining the methods they used to restore them, body and spirit. For Lennox, who had spent his life in the practical and often ruthless world of racing, the level of care and respect Ilara's family had for each horse was astonishing. "This is hard work," Lennox said as they strolled past the stables. "I can't imagine the kind of sacrifices it takes to keep this place running." "It is hard," Ilara agreed with a nod, "but it's also rewarding. Seeing them heal, watching them thrive, it's worth every bit of effort." Lennox fell quiet. As he listened to Ilara, he began to question so much of what he had always taken for granted. He thought about the grueling training schedules, the inhumane expectations placed on racehorses, and realized there was so much he could have done differently. That evening, Ilara invited him to stay for dinner with her family. Around the dinner table, the conversation flowed effortlessly, filled with laughter, stories, and warmth. Ilara's parents shared anecdotes about life on the ranch, while Lennox spoke of Solara's days on the racetrack. But mostly, he listened. He listened as Ilara's family talked about the lessons they'd learned caring for animals others had given up on. "There's such a disconnect," Lennox said at one point, his voice thoughtful. "In racing, we see horses as investments, as tools to win. But here, you see them as individuals, with personalities, with souls. I don't think I ever really considered that before." Ilara looked at him, her expression soft but knowing. "It's not something you can see unless you're willing to look for it." As the evening stretched on, Lennox realized how much had shifted within him. For so long, he'd only seen one path, one way of life. But here, surrounded by the quiet rhythms of the ranch, by the warmth of a family who understood what it meant to care for the forgotten, he felt something crack open inside him. Maybe, just maybe, there was another way forward, one where freedom, love, and respect could coexist. "That's something not many people understand," Ilara said softly, her smile gentle and reassuring, "but I'm glad you're starting to see it now." Before Lennox left, he and Ilara sat together on the porch, watching the stars slowly appear in the velvety night sky. They talked about the future, about their hopes and dreams. "I've been thinking about making some changes," Lennox said suddenly, breaking the silence. "What kind of changes?" Ilara asked, curiosity lighting up her face. "I want to try something different with the horses," Lennox explained. "Maybe take an approach that's more respectful." Ilara turned to look at him, admiration in her eyes. "I've seen the work you do here, and I think we could learn a lot from you. If you need help, we'll be here," Ilara added, her tone warm and sincere. "It's always good to have allies who see things through a more compassionate lens." Those words lingered with Lennox as he drove home that night, their weight settling deep in his thoughts. In the days that followed, Lennox began planning how to introduce the methods he had witnessed at Ilara's ranch. He understood that changing the practices of an industry so deeply rooted in tradition would be no easy task. But he also knew it was a change worth pursuing. Meanwhile, Ilara and her family continued caring for Solara. With each passing day, the horse grew more at ease with the rhythm of the ranch, as though she were finally in tune with her surroundings. From time to time, Ilara would send updates to Lennox, short messages accompanied by photos of Solara galloping through the fields or resting peacefully beneath the sprawling oak trees. One day, Lennox replied with an unexpected proposal. "I think we could work together," he wrote. "Maybe we could develop a program to train horses in a more ethical, respectful way. Combine your experience with my knowledge of the racing world." Ilara smiled as she read his message, a feeling of hope rising within her. After everything they had been through, it felt like something good was finally emerging. "Whenever you're ready to start, we're here," she wrote back. Life at the ranch carried on at a pace that seemed to flow with the rhythms of nature. Solara had fully adapted to her new life, becoming a symbol of everything the ranch stood for. To Ilara, watching the mare run, her strides filled with youthful energy, her presence serene and content, was a daily reminder of why she and her family dedicated their lives to rescuing animals. Each morning, Ilara would spend quiet hours with Solara, brushing her coat as she spoke to her in soft, soothing tones. The horse didn't seem to need words anymore. Her calm, trusting gaze spoke volumes. Solara had gained weight, her muscles were strong and defined, and all traces of the tension that had haunted her during her days on the racetrack had vanished. One afternoon, as Ilara watched Solara grazing beneath the shade of a maple tree, her mother approached with a steaming cup of tea in hand. "It's a miracle, isn't it?" her mother said, her voice soft with wonder. "It really is," Ilara replied, her eyes never leaving Solara. It's like she finally found what she was always looking for. Far from the ranch, Lennox faced a different reality. Returning to the racing world had been a challenge. Rumors about Solara's sudden disappearance had spread like wildfire, and some gamblers who had lost significant money weren't shy about expressing their anger. "Do you honestly think that story's going to convince us?" one man sneered during a tense meeting in the jockey club's office. Lennox stood up, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not here to convince anyone. What happened with Solara wasn't a trick or a scam. It was a decision I made because it was the right thing to do. If that's not good enough for you, there's nothing more I can say." The room fell silent, the weight of Lennox's words hanging in the air. Not everyone was satisfied, but there was something in his unwavering honesty that few could dispute. Finally, one of the organizers, an older man with years of experience in the field, broke the silence. It might not have been what they wanted to hear, but Lennox didn't take long to move forward. Though he had closed an important chapter of his life, he felt something new, beginning. During his most recent visit, he sat with Ilara and her family at the kitchen table, sharing coffee and ideas about a project that, while still in its infancy, seemed full of promise. "I think we could turn this place into something more," Lennox said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "A haven. Not just for rescued horses, but for those whose time on the track has come to an end. We could teach people how to care for them, how to treat them with dignity and respect, the way they deserve." Ilara's mother smiled, her expression softening as she nodded slowly. "We've always dreamed of something like that, but we never had the resources to make it happen. I can help with that," Lennox replied, his tone firm. "It won't be easy, but I believe that together we can pull it off." Ilara looked at him, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "If you're willing to try, then so are we." Over time, the ranch began to transform. With Lennox's financial support and his expertise in horse care, they built new facilities and hired extra hands to help with the animals. At the heart of it all was Solara, the mare who had brought them together. Her story inspired others, and before long, visitors arrived, people eager to learn about ethical, respectful horse care. For Lennox, the change was just as profound. No longer obsessed with the thrill of racing or the lure of profits, he poured his energy into promoting practices that prioritized the horse's well-being. He lost a few business partners along the way, but he gained something far more valuable, a purpose he truly cared about. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, Lennox and Ilara stood by the corral, watching Solara graze peacefully. "Do you regret any of it?" Ilara asked softly, glancing at him. Lennox shook his head, a small, contented smile playing on his lips. "No, everything that happened led us here. I think, in the end, it was Solara who taught us what we needed to know." Ilara nodded, her gaze lingering on the mare. "It's funny how they always seem to understand things better than we do." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was reflective. It was a quiet acknowledgement of the difficult but necessary path they had walked together. As the sun disappeared behind the hills, Solara lifted her head, as though aware of their eyes on her. With graceful, effortless motion, she trotted toward the horizon, her silhouette bathed in the golden glow of the day's last light. For Lennox and Ilara, the image was etched into memory, not as the ending of a story, but the beginning of something greater. And that's the story of Solara, a journey of freedom, love, and understanding. You know, even though this story isn't real, its impact is. It reminds us that sometimes the right path isn't the easiest. Lennox and Ilara's story, alongside Solara, teaches us so much about compassion, towards animals, towards others, and even towards ourselves. What I love most about this tale is its humanity. It shows how we often hold on to things, thinking they belong to us, but true care and love sometimes mean letting go. Solara didn't just find her freedom. She brought Lennox and Ilara together, changing them both for the better. And how often do we really think about animals, like horses, as having spirits, emotions, and a need for happiness? Solara's story challenges us to see beyond profit, beyond appearances, and focus on what truly matters: respect, dignity, and harmony with the world around us. For me, this isn't just about a horse and a ranch. It's about the decisions we make every day and the values we choose to live by. Do we take the easy road, or do we fight for what's right? Lennox, at first blinded by the racing world, had to unlearn everything and start over. That kind of transformation is powerful. But now, I want to hear from you. What did you think about Solara and Ilara's connection? Would you have made the same choice as Lennox? Drop your thoughts in the comments and let's keep this conversation going. And hey, if this story inspired you even a little, share it with someone you think needs to hear it. Thank you for sticking with me to the end. Until next time, keep your heart open and your mind curious. See you in the next one.